My name is Peter Allison, and I am the Network Director for Farm to Institution New England. There I am. And let me just set the table for our webinar today. Following some brief remarks about FINE in the context of our food service project, we'll focus our discussion on the new toolkit that's designed to clarify the process of working with food service management companies to incorporate more local and regional food into their menus. We'll guide you through the different sections of the toolkit and then talk about how it can be used by various partners, including food service professionals, consultants, and advocates. And we'll wrap up with a question and answer period. As there's close to 400 people registered for the webinar, we're putting you all on mute to avoid any background noise. However, please do type questions into the chat box, and we will address as many of those as possible at the end of the question period. And we'll also follow up with some additional communications afterward with any questions that we don't address. We view this webinar and this project very much as a work in progress, and as such, we always welcome comments and suggestions on strategies to help us in our efforts to strengthen our food system. So want to provide that bit of context. Next slide, and the next one. So let me just begin by giving you a little bit of introduction to FINE. We are a 6-state network of nonprofit, public, and private entities working to strengthen our regional food system by increasing the amount of food grown in our region that's processed and served in our region, schools, hospitals, colleges, and other institutions. Next slide. We focus on institutional procurement to increase markets for producers, provide healthy, delicious food for consumers, and support good jobs along the supply chain. Institutions, as you know, are a really big market. Our research indicates that here in New England, we spend over $1 billion a year on food with institutions, and we feed about 3.8 million consumers. That's about 1 in 4 people in the region. We're in the process right now of analyzing some recent survey data to determine the volume of local food purchased by different types of institutions in each sector. And while the quantity of local purchases varies based on a variety of factors, one thing is really abundantly clear. The demand for local products across the board is strong and rising. FINE's work really falls into 2 broad categories. First, as shown in this slide here, we work to grow the network of businesses, organizations, agencies, and other value chain facilitators who are working in the farm to institution arena. And we do this through our communications, convenings, and collaboration. The other part of our work involves coordinating specific projects that we develop in concert with our partners to address key leverage points in the farm to institution supply chain. Next slide. The food service project is one of our major efforts over the past 3 years. And as noted here, we conduct research and provide education, resource development, and technical assistance for institutional leaders and supply chain partners. Our goal is to address the systemic barriers and forge innovative solutions to increase procurement of local food at all institutions. Next slide. We have been extremely fortunate to have assembled an outstanding project team to guide and implement this project, as you can see here. This group of folks has a tremendous amount of experience and insights into all facets of institutional food service, and you'll hear from a number of them today. And throughout the project's duration, we've also relied heavily on input from scores of current and former food service management company officials and staff who've been willing to share their insider's perspective. So we really appreciate the involvement of the whole project team and the business participants that we've worked with. Next slide. And And so that's a picture of us in living color. Next slide, please. The project, the food service project, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the first two phases and turn it over to get us into the toolkit. During the first phase of the project, we conducted research on the current practices, policies, and infrastructure related to the procurement of local food within two food service management companies at institutions in our region. And based on that research, we produced these two publications. The first, very detailed strategies to overcoming barriers to sourcing local food by food service management companies. And the second focused on maximizing opportunities in the request for proposal process and with different types of contracts. And many of you may have been on a webinar that we held around this time last year that featured these reports. The second phase of the project is just concluding right now, and it included a deep dive into the financial details of a sample of institutional dining operations run by companies in the region, and it culminated with a toolkit that we are just releasing and focusing on here today. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stacia Clinton, who is the National Director for Healthcare, for Healthy Food and Healthcare, and with Healthcare Without Harm. And until this past month, Stacia was actually the New England Director for Healthcare Without Harm and a core member of FIND's leadership team. Stacia has served as the primary organizer of this project since its inception, and I just want to take a moment to thank Stacia for sharing her vision, experience, tenacious capacity to herd cats, and a constant, warm, and welcoming sense of humor throughout the project. And while we will miss her presence here in New England, we look forward to staying in collaboration on the national front. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Stacia.
Wow, that was a nice introduction that I wasn't prepared for. Thank you, Peter. Yes, this has certainly been a very exciting and dynamic project, and I just want to reiterate that what Peter mentioned is that really the tremendous value of the project has been the inclusiveness with which we have conducted a lot of the research and the project development. We've done our best to really try to get all facets and all perspectives at the table and creating some tools and resources and guidance that is really going to reflect the many different parties that are involved in institutional purchasing and increasing local purchasing by New England institutions. So our next slide, I'm going to be the one that's going to walk you through some of the toolkit. I did have a hand in the development, but by all means, there was over 20 individuals that contributed to the development of this toolkit, in addition to a numerous number of resources that are linked within it. When creating this toolkit, we found that through phase 1 and phase 2 of the research that we found a tremendous number of resources and tools that institutions could use to increase their sourcing of local, whether it was guidance documents, case studies, other kinds of orientation materials, but they were all over the place, and they weren't really pulled together in one format that could guide people through kind of the most salient opportunities to increase their purchasing towards local. So the goal of this was really to not only create a one-stop shop where we collate a lot of existing resources, but to fill in the gaps of areas where we could see a need for additional education. And really, it encourages a common language so that facilities can articulate their interest in local food, and food service management companies can respond with market intelligence, pricing, and operational support. And it really is setting up both parties for success, because we know if you're not speaking the same language, how are you going to be on the same page? The real goal of the project, of the toolkit, is really to raise the base level understanding for all of the entities working in front institution efforts on basically how institutional purchasing works, and really it digs in a little deeper into how to use the contract and the request for proposal, or RFP, process to engage all parties in achieving their local purchasing goals. Now, however, we did mention that this is specific for those who are working with food service management companies, which you'll find that many of the tools and resources in this can be used for those who are also independently operated, who are working with group purchasing organizations, otherwise known as GPOs, and those who are doing direct contracts with their distributors, because there's some really valuable resources in here to approach those situations as well. And just so you know, if I run through any terms that are not familiar to you, this toolkit does include a glossary at the end. So in hindsight, just jot those down and you can visit the glossary at the very end. In developing the toolkit, we did have a primary audience being those that are in the institutions. So those might be the food service directors or support services or auxiliary staff. It may be administrators looking for 1 or 2 bits of information needed for their process. It could be sustainability coordinators, anybody really working on the goal to increase their local sourcing or involved in the contract and RFP process. However, we know those are very busy people, and so our secondary audience is really those working with institutions that we call supply chain facilitators as an official title. So those could be consultants, food system consultants, nonprofit staff, or technical assistance providers that are intersecting with the institutions. One thing to note about the actual research for the toolkit is that there are some limitations to this study. So we recognize that this research helps to inform new trends and the direction and of which the institutional sector is going. Also helps to identify some salient barriers and challenges that are occurring. But due to the fact that it was a small sample size, we can't make any correlations to the entire sector or institutional sector as a whole. So that was the limitation of the phase 2. However, the various reviewers and contributors to the toolkit does give us a very robust set of resources and tools that are really valid. One additional limitation is the fact that we recognized that in doing some of the research, what we had done was had to be specific to the sectors that we worked with, and we recognized that healthcare and the college sector are a little more similar than the K-12 sector. And for that reason, we are lacking some specific guidance for the K-12 sector in that region. We'll talk a little bit more about next phases of the project and what we're looking to develop, but that is one limitation, that there could use some additional refining and development for that particular institutional sector. Last, I'm just going to mention that one piece that I will go through when I walk you through the toolkit is the key recommendations. We thought as we developed this very large toolkit that it could be overwhelming to many. And so if you walk away with nothing else than these key recommendations there, we see them as the top 4 levers for how to best advocate and move the system towards aligning strategies, dispelling confusion in the marketplace, and really working towards achieving our collective goal of more local food in institutions. So next slide, and Caitlin, at this point, I think what you can do is have me share my screen, and I will start walking folks through this. Let's see. So that you should have a good view of the toolkit now. Okay, so what you're looking at right now is the website for Farm to Institution New England, and I just want to direct your attention to the very top here. Is if I go to the front landing page here for Farm to Institution New England, you'll see that there's a link right here at the very beginning to access the toolkit. So if I go there, you'll see at the very top, you'll see a list of the different core sections of the resource. However, if I scroll down, you could essentially scroll through the entire toolkit if you wanted. But however, to make it more user-friendly, you can also jump to particular sections by using the hyperlinks. First thing to show you is that there is this button available throughout the resource where you can click and create a PDF of the resource. That way you can select which pages you want to print, whether you're doing a workshop or an orientation, or you're sharing it with an institution you're working with. That's the best way to be able to create printable copies. So some of this preliminary information here, I've already kind of reviewed with you, but I will come back to this green section here called Engage, which is an opportunity to be able to contact us with comments and questions, additions, edits, and other requests. And I'll reference that at the end of the session today. So here's really kind of what I see as the core landing page. The table of contents is linked through these blue categories here, and then there are subsections under each one of them. And so we're going to go through some of them briefly and more deeply into others. So I'm going to actually start scrolling down here through the acknowledgements that we mentioned earlier today. And in the introduction here, you can always reference information about Farm Institution New England. And then section B here was a really interesting and important kind of a visioning exercise that was done by this dynamic advisory board that Peter highlighted, that came together and said, you know, we're creating a resource and we're working with institutions, and what's really the vision that we're looking to achieve here within our food system, and what needs to change within that system to make local food purchasing more the norm. In order to do that, we recognize that some of the kind of business practices within the food system need to change. And so we started to draft out and identify some of the values of and kind of the core principles of a food service business would maintain in order to really facilitate the local food purchasing as the norm. And so we recognize this model may evolve in response to changes in the food system, but it can serve as a guide for food businesses that aggregate food and offer procurement services to institutions so that you can possibly evaluate your own practices, or even for food system advocates to work towards assisting these businesses and aligning with some of the vision outlined here. So here is an overview about the toolkit. It provides a little bit more detail about the research here and what was conducted. As Peter mentioned, we had over 40 interviews with food system advocates and management staff for phase 1. In phase 2 of the research, we had done a baseline assessment of over 60 New England schools, and then an in-depth analysis, including the baseline assessment for an additional 7 New England institutions, 4 hospitals and 3 colleges within the region. And I will note that there was at least 1 independently operated facility within those samples. Okay, so moving down into section 3, this is really institutional purchasing 101 that I'm not going to dive too deeply into. What I will note is that this is really the nuts and bolts of how institutional purchasing works. Many of us know it to varying degrees. Even those working within institutions know it to varying degrees. So this is a really good 101 reorientation of all the many facets of institutional purchasing. You could consider using this when you're orienting new staff, or when you're participating in technical assistance with institutions and you're bringing maybe other disciplines on board to work on the contract and RFP process. Others outside food service may want to know how the system works. It can be used for both self-operated and those who purchase with a group purchasing organization, or who outsource to food service management companies. We cover all of those various aspects. And we also outline how institutional purchasing works with regards to volume purchasing, setting pricing, and also even trickling down into menu development. You also want to draw your attention to here how, I'm kind of scrolling through, you'll see that each one of the sections has an opportunity to link back to the top. So if I do that here, I can come right back. We just went through sections 1, 2, and 3, and now I'm going to click on section 4, which is bringing you to descriptions in hospitals, colleges, and K through 12 staff members. And this is pretty straightforward. However, what we do is articulate the key staff position within these different organizations, and then the role that they play in purchasing or decision making around their food purchasing. That could be important for folks who may be going into an institution for the first time and want to know which personnel to actually contact to work with directly. Moving into key research findings. As I mentioned, the research that was conducted did provide some really interesting trends with regards to general areas of institutional food service, also those happening within food service management companies, within institutions, and then also specific trends relating to general food system barriers that are really interesting and important to keep in mind when planning any programs or intersecting with those working in the institutional procurement sector. I will note that we did identify some major findings from the facility comparison project. So from the 7 facilities that were researched in more depth, we were able to pull out some trends as a result of those 7 facilities and the analysis that was done. So we have general findings and then specific sector findings that were pulled out there. And now I'm going to dive in a little deeper to the section I had mentioned previously called our key recommendations. So again, this is the area where we mentioned, if you take anything away from the webinar today, these 4 A, B, C, D listed here, 4 items would be the core pieces that we would want you to take home and consider using in your own work. So in identifying those core recommendations, walking through the first one here, we mentioned providing a clear and detailed definition of local. And what that means is actually going beyond just the concept of what the geographic range is. When people talk about purchasing local food, I think if you ask them to sit down and define what that means, everybody would say something different. And so I think it's important to articulate not only the geographic range you're talking about, whether that is 100 miles, 250 miles, whether it's more even broader in regional scope, but also what are the values that are implied when this person is talking about local. Because we recognize for a lot of people, local food means a lot of things. It means economic viability for farms and businesses in that region. It means potentially being ecologically responsible with their production practices. So in articulating what that really means, you're able to sit down at the table with others and compare where you have differing definitions. You're also setting up a transparent and process for communication so that everybody involved knows what we're talking about when you're trying to achieve those goals. We provide some examples here of values-based definitions. That's what we refer to as definitions that include the values surrounding local food. And we've listed those here for you to reference when trying to articulate that for yourselves or for your organization. Moving into the second key recommendation, we came to recognize that the contract and RFP process is quite rigorous and requires a very unique skill set. And so not only getting through all the very basic components of a contract, meaning what type of contract it is, what about capital investments or other type of equipment expenses, and basic operational flow, that when you add onto it the need to and the priority to source local foods, you really need to be well articulate and understand the process well. And who better to do that than food system consultants who do this for a living. And so in this section, we really offer some key skill sets that the reviewers and interviewed facilities mentioned were of value to them through the RFP and contract process. And you can use that in trying to identify a consultant. Because while these consultants are often a wealth of knowledge, I think the skill set, having the ability to really articulate goals and values around local food purchasing and carry that through the RFP process, through the contract negotiations, to the final contract is a unique skill that you'll want to ensure that any consultant you work with is able to bring on board. And I will say that for facilities that are a bit smaller and may not have the funds to actually secure a consultant for this process, if you oftentimes pool resources with other small facilities that may be in your area, there's an opportunity to bring a consultant on board to offer that service for you as a local system. or local set of facilities. So moving into section C here, the third key recommendation, we talk about setting quantitative purchasing commitments. And this is something that's gaining quite a bit more traction now with food service contracts. A colleague of mine states that if you can't change, you can't really change what you don't measure. And there are really some industry standards here for what types of priorities or standards that you can set for local purchasing that you can reference. So we encourage you to look to set an overall local food purchasing goal percentage based on the total dollars of spend on food. It's also really important to consider that you look into setting specific measurable goals around multiple product categories. That way you're ensuring that when you're purchasing local foods, that you're purchasing them and from a diverse set of categories, and you're helping to grow the various different development of agricultural production in different systems. And it's not just focused in one area. You know, it may make sense to actually determine that goal by doing first some market-based analysis of the opportunities for growth in the regional agricultural system. And that's important because you don't want to just set a goal and then realize that the system is going to has a significant number of barriers to scale up to meet that goal. You want to make this something that is a reach, but is still achievable. And so doing a little bit of that ahead of time will help you to do that. And then the fourth key recommendation that we mentioned here has multiple components to it, but it really is emphasizing the importance of utilizing the RFP and contract process to ensure that there is transparency and accountability all across that process, and also what you actually come to actually follow through with as an organization. So we provide guidance for adding transparency and accountability in the RFP process, when writing the final contract, and even when implementing and evaluating the goals of the contract. And I will say that I feel like the third, to me, is a very important component that's often missed. So you get all the way through securing the RFP and writing the contract, but you haven't articulated how you're actually going to implement it or even evaluate all parties involved. That could be your supply chain players, including suppliers, including management companies or group purchasing, including your purchasing department or your food service director as a purchaser. So it's important to really think about what that evaluation will look like. So if I move you all back to the top here in the table of contents, we're going to move past the key recommendations and really into some of the really in-depth guidance that we provide on the bid and the RFP development process. So you'll see here the bid is what you put out for securing a food service management company, or even if you're going directly to suppliers, you want to look at what kind of specifications that you want within those relationships. So it's important that you recognize that you can use this bid and RFP development guidance at any stage in the contract. We encourage you to develop an interdisciplinary team that outlines your core values, because then you will use that kind of clear picture of your values will be used to guide the development of the bid specification so that you can clearly articulate to those you're looking to build a relationship with what your values are. We give you a step-by-step on how, through specific components of the RFP, you articulate your values and local food goals. And then we also drive home here at the very end the bid, really setting up an evaluation scoring for those who bid on the process. And that's an important piece because we recognize that you could articulate your values, but you want a fair process for evaluating all who bid on your RFP. And if you articulate your values and you weight them appropriately, giving them the kind of which is more important or the priority level for those that you want to bring on board, you'll be sure to kind of you'll build a relationship with an entity that really can meet your priority goals. So this is a pretty extensive section, moving you through that process. And I'm going to move now into the food service management company contracts. Now, we actually went back and forth in developing this piece because there's a lot of different contracts that can exist. You could create a contract directly with a supplier. You could be a member of a group purchasing organization, which consists of some sort of member agreement. But we really found that there was a lack of clarity and understanding specifically related to food service management companies and what it actually is included in the contract. So what we were able to do is just to outline the basic components of a food service management company contract, including the basic contracting components. You know, and we recognize that these vary widely from different sectors, also to how they've been articulated. In terms of the types of contracts, I think it's important to recognize too that this is an important piece that you can actually look at in terms of where the ownership of different components of the contract or the program that you're outlining for your food service lie. So for instance, you may have a type of contract where any additional expenses that weren't articulated in the contract may be incurred by the facility. And so that in that case, they would be billed by your partner organization for the facility to pay for on top of. That would really allow the facility to maintain some ownership over new or additional projects that they want to put into place. We outline some important information on many different opportunities to work on your contract. So it could be approaching a new food service contract, including contract negotiation considerations. We talk about amending your contract. So say you're in mid-contract and you really want to make a change because you're noticing that you haven't articulated a particular value or a goal very well in your original contract. I think those businesses that you have a relationship with that are really dedicated to your partnership will be very willing to consider an amendment in order to help you meet your goals. If for some reason that isn't the case, you can certainly use you know, the values that you've outlined and start a conversation so that when the time comes for your contract to be up, you can certainly articulate them better and position your existing partner in the best stage for meeting those goals. We also talk here about implementing your contract. This is an important section, as I mentioned, that I think is often missed, is that we want to be able to articulate how are you not only implementing some of the criteria or the basic operations, but also how are you encouraging kind of a transformation within the culture of the organization. If you're really starting to implement a new program, it's important that you consider whether or not new employees are oriented to the local purchasing goals and the values of the organization. Are they educated as to why this is important to the institution? Do employee evaluations, both of those for the contracted staff and the facility managed staff, outline and benchmark around the procurement or education of local food. And then you can also consider things like, you know, in terms of your standing meetings that you may have to check in with your food service partners. You may have those with distributors, with food service management companies. Have you set up any key performance indicators that are based in their evaluation, their staff evaluation, to say these are things that are important and I want to hear, you know, let's get an update on those every meeting so that we can see how our partnership is working and whether or not we're achieving the goals that we laid forward in the beginning. So that's a really important piece that I think oftentimes gets missed. We provide some guidelines here for criteria and potential tracking spreadsheets and some other ways in which other organizations have created a format for tracking that progress. So I'm moving to the end here, and the last piece I will mention is the appendix. So the appendix is going to be an ever-evolving component of the toolkit where we welcome additions from you and additional resources we may have missed that you think should be linked in the toolkit, as well as any volunteers wanting to help to develop a new component to be added. I just want to note a couple things here in the appendix. Is that we have listed some sample job descriptions of food service positions where it has been well articulated the local food goals. And so that way, when you're kind of looking for new staff, you're articulating your values right off the bat. I'll also note that we have some stories shared from facilities, both those transitioning to self-operated food service, as well as we're working to develop and create case studies on facilities who have established successful partnerships with food service management companies or other supply chain partners to help them meet their local food goals. All right, that brings us to the end of this point. And so what I'd like to do is have Caitlin take back the platform. And what we're going to do now is have to hear a short presentation from 3 different representatives that are kind of, that represent the different audiences that may be using this toolkit and that intersect with institutions in different ways. We're actually going to start with hearing from Jennifer White, who is going to give us the perspective from those working within an institution. So Jennifer is the Director of Sustainability and an Assistant Professor at Colby Sawyer College. She also has served on the Food Service Project Advisory Board for the Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the project. So welcome, Jen. And Jen, I think you may be on mute, so just make sure that you're not so we can hear you.
Thank you, Stacia. Can you hear me now?
We can. You sound great.
Thank you. So as Stacia mentioned, I think one of the best ways to start with the toolkit, if you're working from an institutional perspective, is to really walk through the table of contents and get a sense of what is contained in the toolkit and see which type of information might be valuable to you. It really is just an excellent source of information. There's, as Stacia already reviewed, there's a lot of information in terms of compilations of best practices for institutions. It includes research on food service management companies, institutions, and the food system just in general, which is a really great resource and benefit in terms of supplementing whatever internal data collection you might be doing on your own dining services practices, any surveys you're doing with your clients or students. The overview of the contract and food service management types, the attributes and benefits and challenges can be really beneficial, especially if you're someone coming to an institution and don't have a lot of experience with this. Provides a great overview of those different types. It also provides information about purchasing guidelines and techniques such as collective purchasing and pre-buying if you're looking for different ways to collaborate with institutions in your area. This can help you look at what other institutions have done to be successful to keep costs down and to access adequate volumes for your dining services. It provides links to case studies and further information, and as Stacia went through in some detail, the key recommendations. It also has a great value across the institution itself, as the next slide will demonstrate. Whether you're a CEO level or in management, if you're looking at developing strategic planning relating to your dining services, and also sustainability initiatives. If you're a sustainability director and coordinator and trying to understand how the food service practices that you have and the values of your institution related to sustainability, whether it's related to health and well-being, social justice issues, economic stability, or ecological balance, how those all come together and are expressed in how your food service management company works in your institution and what your dining services actually provides. It's also great for food service management staff, both on and off-site. If you're training people in your institution to understand local food procurement process and how that can be maximized on site, this is a great resource for that. Also, your admissions and advancement staff, I think for a lot of us, our food service is a lot of how we conduct our marketing and how we retain our students. So there's a lot of information in here, I think, in terms of understanding what different institutions might be doing and how they're approaching their food service management and what the opportunities might be to communicate that more clearly. And also for faculty and students, this is a really great educational resource for students who are learning about the food system, for those who might be pursuing employment in food service profession, and also for vendors to understand the architecture of institutional food service procurement and some of the opportunities and challenges that might exist for them as they're getting into this as a specific sector of their practice. And the toolkit is also applicable really to all phases of the process. You don't have to be in the midst of the RFP or contracting process It's really great in terms of having examples for how to clarify and articulate your values and language. There's a great section that Stacia went through about that. That's really not just about local food. A lot of us might gravitate towards local food for environmental reasons, for reasons in terms of supporting a strong local economy or issues related to well-being. So I think tying those together and really being able to clarify what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your local food procurement or sustainable food procurement, it's really helpful in having some best practices for that. Certainly, if you are in the process of setting up and executing your RFP or contracting process, this is an excellent resource for that and can walk you step by step through what that process can look like. And also, as Stacia mentioned, selecting a consultant, and one of the other speakers on the webinar today will talk about that in some detail as well. If you're not in the process of working on a contract, certainly borrowing from some of the other contract language that have been successful at other institutions and understanding how to leverage that, and learning the different ways that you can set up some of those quantitative purchasing commitments. There are a lot of different ways to do that. You can phase in those different goals, or you can look at different categories, and there's a lot of great examples about how to approach that process as well. And the implementation, I think sometimes we fall through on that side of things. We get a policy in place and then haven't thought too much about how are we going to implement the process, hold ourselves accountable, look back and see whether or not we've made the progress that we really set out to make. And certainly in terms of education and conducting research, for myself at an educational institution, a lot of what we try and do is involve our students in all aspects of this process. So this is a great resource for students to learn about what the food service system looks like, and for us to help really explain what it is that we're doing in terms of our dining services and why we're making those choices, so that when our students head out into their own professions and communities, they understand what those decisions were driven by and may incorporate some of those same decision-making processes into their own work. So I'm going to turn it over to John, I think, now. Stacia, would you like to do that introduction?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jen. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to John Tureen, who's going to provide the perspective from a food service consultant. John is the president and founder of Sustainable Food Systems, LLC. He has also served on the Food Service Project Advisory Board on Phase 1 and Phase 2. So welcome, John.
Thanks, Stacia. I'm going to assume I'm off mute here, so I'm going to keep rolling here. So it's interesting when we get started on this project and on this process as a food service consultant, my first reaction in the early stages was, oh my gosh, we're creating a toolkit that could make my job and other consultants' jobs obsolete. But as we just saw and heard, this isn't the case, because there's a lot going on and a lot of in-depth comprehension that needs to be valued by the clients or the institutions. So we think it's very, very important for consultants to be able to use this, because as you're going to hear from me now, why not only is it important to consultants, but if you're a consultant listening now, your clients are going to be using this. So that's kind of important to know. So, as Peter mentioned earlier too, our clients are saying there's an expanding farm to institution demand even as we speak. So we, the consultants, are the experts, right? We're tried and true in the operational and management experiences. We bring invaluable knowledge and experience and service to our clients. So we're the experts. We're hired to execute what the institution cannot do or does not have the expertise, maybe, or the resources or the times to do themselves. We're the hired guns, so to say. But we can never forget our allegiance is to our clients, and our best work is based on the skill of good listening. That said, I implore any consultants tuned in right now is to listen up. Maybe go to the next slide, Caitlin. Thanks. So how can we benefit? So here's a start. Think about this. We're recommending that the institutions hire you. To me, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good start. Secondly, distinct connection between a consultant and client is absolutely critical. So if the client is seeing this toolbox as a resource, it kind of serves the consultant well to be in sync with the client or the potential client. You know, how critical is it for the consultant to clearly understand the jargon? There's a lot out there, a lot of terminologies, or what I call the lexicon of the local food movement. If the client is asking or knows it, well, the consultant had better get it. If you ask me, I think it's critical that we know the language, so we can learn inside this toolbox and toolkit along the lines of that as well. And I'm hearing more and more consultants who connect and communicate with the outside advocacy groups, which we'll hear about in a few seconds here too, will be an advantage. So they know, these outside advocacy groups know what their clients are hearing. So again, it behooves us as consultants to really get in touch and in sync with these advocacy groups. And then this last piece here too is that, you know, clients will select consultants based on our experience. So there's the direction that they'll take selecting us. If they're learning what attributes the consultant should have, I think it makes sense for us to know what we should know, or what they think we should know. So that's important as well. Go to the next slide. Thanks. So in the section 7, when Stacia was going through it under guidance, there was some really valuable information and resources that, you know, I'll just touch on here. I don't know about others, but anytime I have the chance to know about what my clients are learning about what I should know as a consultant, I better know. I realize it's probably a bit of a tongue twister, but if you think about that, it's good to know what the people who are going to hire me think I should know, I guess is what I'm saying. If my potential clients are being given these kinds of tips that are in this toolkit to consider when going out to bid, et cetera, then I, as a consultant, are being asked to facilitate these deliverables. It behooves me to know it like they know it, right? That's important too. And then here's a tip, or sometimes, as I say, the secret recipe for the secret sauce. There's a how-to framework for specifications development, checklists, definitions, aka the lexicon that I talked about. All these are in there. This secret recipe for the secret sauce, so it's beneficial to use. There's a sample outline, detailed explanations of the various sections of the proposal, which would be in a proposal. That's important to know. There's also examples of evaluation criteria for submitted proposals that, as a consultant or as the institution will receive and will be reviewing. Rather than have to build it from scratch or from past examples, there's some criteria that other institutions have used for evaluating proposals. That's good to know. That's in here too. And on top of all that, don't forget, here are some ways to craft an RFP to increase local procurement. This is ultimately the bottom line for this effort. And as a consultant, I want to know what's happening. Or as I often say to my colleagues, you know, we as consultants, if we're not on the cutting edge, we're going to be left behind. So here's a tool to sharpen that edge. So we better use it or lose it, so to say. Kind of get my gist. So that's what I see benefiting, just the tip of the iceberg for consultants. So I'm going to introduce now our next guest speaker. I'd like to hand it over to Riley Neubauer, Northern New England Coordinator for FINE's Farm to College Project, and also a member of the Food Service Project Advisory Board. And Riley's going to discuss ways that food systems advocates might use the toolkit to advance their objectives. Take it, Riley.
Thanks, John. Hello to everyone. Thanks for being on the webinar today. So I'm going to speak to the audience that might be more on the outside of the process. So wherever you might sit, you may not be the consultant or the decision maker, but have a reason to care about these contracts in the food system at the institution that you're a part of or that you are in the community with. So the first slide gives you a sense of really some of who the individuals and the groups of people might be that would want to advocate for improved contracts at their local institution. And I'm sure there are more than what I have here as well. And each advocate really might use the toolkit a little bit differently based on their knowledge about the contracting process or their ability to be heard by the folks who are making the decisions. But I think the toolkit can be helpful to anyone, regardless of which position you might find yourself in. Next slide. So I think the first thing that you want to do as an advocate is better understand the contracting process in general and generate a list of informed questions that you can then try to find the answers to. So if you're a community member or a nonprofit staff member, for example, who's curious to learn more about a contracting process at a local campus or a hospital, you might want to look into the Institutional Purchasing 101 section of the toolkit in section 3 to just learn more and get a better sense of this. And then that might lead you to ask yourself whether the institution is managed by a food service company or if it's self-operated, if there might be a group purchasing organization involved, if it's a hospital. And you might want to know what the timeline is for the contract. Is it up for rebidding anytime soon? Did it just happen? And also if there's a public process that can allow others to be engaged in providing input or not. And then once you've gone through the first part of that section and have an initial set of questions you might want to get answers to, you can then check out the section in the toolkit that's more about personnel that Stacia went over earlier. And so it's grouped by institutional sector, so you can find, who are the people that either are decision makers or that you may already have a connection to so that you can get more information from them. Often the procurement staff or the dining staff are going to be the people that are most involved with this, but you may, at a college, for example, want to reach out to a sustainability coordinator as a first step if there is one at the campus, because that person can often get information more easily than you can and has a role that's partly about integrating the institution into the community more. So you can also do online research in addition to the toolkit to see if you can find other information. I know Real Food Challenge has found some good info online just through looking at student newspapers and things to find out what's going on with contracts, for example. So in addition to figuring out the people that you want to talk to just get some basic info, you can also start to identify who those higher level decision makers are that you may ultimately want to influence or have impact over in the future. Next slide. So once you know a little bit more about how the contract works at the institution, who to talk to, and who the decision makers are, then you can really start to get more clarity on what it is that you might do as an advocate. It's important to have those clear values and goals that Stacia and Jen and others have talked about. And you can probably do that most effectively if you're doing it with other collaborators, other organizations, other community members, other folks to help sort of build your case and to push for what you're asking for. And either way, when you're trying to influence a process that's really ultimately focused on a written agreement, you just really need to make sure that what you're doing is very clear and that you can write it down to pass along to the folks that you're trying to influence. So I think there's a ton of sections of the toolkit that can ultimately help you with that, with both the values and goals piece and having really specific language. Most notably, I think sections 6 and 7 are most applicable there. And your goals might focus on local, they might focus on fair labor, sustainable growing practices. I think other folks have touched on that, but whatever they might be, I think the toolkit can really help you look at how to do that. And to give a specific example, I was recently a part of an effort in Maine where I worked with several other organizations, students, farmers, and community members in order to deliver a set of recommended language and goals for the humane systems RFP and contract process. And we spent a lot of time focusing on the goals and the language, and it ended up being a pretty large document, 60 or 70 pages, that's linked in the toolkit, and you can look at it yourself. And we saw a lot of input and edits to it before we submitted it to the humane system to get a lot of stakeholder support. And some of our primary goals were commitments to 20% local food and 20% real food from the humane system. The local food commitment and many other elements from our recommendations were included in the RFP that went out, so we were fairly successful. And I think those kinds of specific pieces that are linked in the toolkit can really be useful to you depending on your particular situation. Next slide. So some institutions may be really open and allow you to provide a lot of input to their process, either by way of formal mechanisms like a committee that allows for stakeholder input, and others may not really require any sort of external input. So thinking through what your strategy is going to be for communicating your suggestions is important, and also being realistic about what your expectations are is really key. One step here is thinking through your audience. So you could use section 4 of the toolkit to think about who you're really trying to reach with your goals and suggestions. And in addition to the direct recipients that might be a purchasing manager, a dining director, you're probably also really going to want to think about your broader audience of stakeholders that can really help you be successful and who you want to make sure are informed at minimum and possibly much more engaged in your effort to influence the contract. So that could be other nonprofits, farmers, fishermen, businesses, processors, policymakers, et cetera. Those other folks will really help you establish your credibility so that when you're presenting this to the decision makers, it's taken more seriously. It may involve generating awareness about your values and goals among those other folks or among the people who are ultimately eating the food, the farmers, the fishermen who are going to be hopefully a part of the next contract, and other organizations. In the humane system effort, we were able to gather endorsements from over 50 individuals and organizations around the state, for example, and so that really helped in addition to doing student petitions and farmer letter sign-ons and things like that. And we were really good about getting the press to cover some of the work that we were doing, because that also helped tell the story about our effort and how we were trying to engage a broader group of people in influencing the contract. So the one last piece here is that I think you should really try to be as aware as you can about the timing so that you can get your recommendations to the people who need to see it, who are making the decisions about what will go in the contract at the right time. Because if you miss that window and they don't have time to incorporate it because it's a pretty lengthy process typically, then you may have to wait until the next time around. Next slide. So lastly, we'll talk a little bit about collaboration. So before or after the RFP has gone out, you're probably going to be interested in what's going to happen when the contract does go into effect and how there'll be some kind of accountability. And so you can ask for a role in ongoing governance and implementation. They may not take you up on that offer, but you can always ask what that's going to look like and if there's room for community or other stakeholder engagement. Often the institutional decision makers that you're working with might be interested in having those voices at the table. So that what your role might be could be assisting with the development of tools for tracking and evaluating the vendor's ability to meet the goals that are laid out in the contract, serving as some sort of advisor to a governance team, helping identify funding or other resources in partnership with the institution to help them meet their goals. And ultimately, if you're not included at all, you could consider trying to serve as more of a watchdog group that finds other ways to evaluate and measure the progress to create more public accountability. So there are a lot of ways to get engaged as an advocate, and I think the opportunities and the outcomes will look really different at each institution, but I think that the toolkit can be a really great place to get you started and give you a lot of resources. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stacia Clinton again.
Great. Thanks so much to Jen and John and Riley for doing that, providing your perspective. So we are at the top of the hour, and I just want to end with a couple of items that you'll see right smack in the middle of the page there, an opportunity to get involved. You certainly, if you have found this information interesting, you maybe go through the toolkit and you decide you want to do a workshop or a session for your staff or more broadly for your network, feel free to contact us because we can provide some guidance on that. We encourage you to spread the word. A toolkit is only as good as its implementation. So we want to make sure that people are actually using all of the resources that were put into this. And I encourage you to stay tuned for more. I encourage you also to volunteer any of your resources or guidance on the development of some of these pieces that we will be looking to develop over this next year, namely the tip sheets for unique audiences, something maybe that you particularly found useful, any innovations within the supply chain, including those with working with food service management companies, case studies, and specifically any guidance around specific pieces that could be developed for K through 12. And with that, I think I will close today and encourage you to please feel free to send your questions and comments that are available, that you can do so on the website. There's a site on the landing page, as well as I showed you in the very beginning, that green box where you can offer comments at any time with regards to the resources. And we welcome your questions at that time. So thank you all for joining us.